tell you what I remember, and I'll tell you straight. No polish, no decoration. You want the hero's version? Go find someone else. What I have is the truth, which is usually less clean and always more expensive. My name is John Brennick, former captain, Black Berets, 3rd Expeditionary Division, 7 years active and 2 more, as a contract advisor, before they decided my file had enough dust on it to close. Former husband, before the law decided that was a crime too. Or not the marriage itself, but the consequence of it. The specific consequence that got us both taken at the border crossing north of Tucson on a cold morning in February, with nothing in the vehicle but Karen's medical records and a bag of clothes for a child who had not yet been born. Form for Freeman. Before the Mental Corporation decided that a second pregnancy was an offense against the population code of the North American Federated Zone, and that 31 years underground was the appropriate correction for the offense. 31 years. I remember the way Poe said it. Director Poe. I mean the warden, the man-shaped thing in the good suit with the calibrated eyes. The way he said it, the way you'd say a invoice total. Flat. Conclusive. Done. I'm telling you this because people ask. They want to know how a man in a cage, a man with a pain induction implant threaded through his intestines like a live wire, a man whose every dream was monitored and filed, and occasionally interrupted by a corporate AI, a man who had been reduced to a number and a cell assignment and a work shift schedule, could end up being the one thing that changed the shape of the world. They want a story with architecture, beginning, a middle, a turn, a moment of triumph where the music comes in and everything that was broken gets repaired. I'm not sure I have that. What I have is a sequence of things that happened, most of them bad, a few of them strange beyond my ability to fully account for, and one of them, one small, unremarkable, private thing, so quietly human that I still don't know whether to be proud of it or simply grateful that nobody stopped me from doing it. That last part is where this story lives. Everything else is just the context. The intake process at the fortress took 4 hours and was designed, I understood very quickly, to function as its own kind of orientation, not in the sense of information transfer, in the sense of establishing, through the specific sequence of things they did to your body, and your file, and your sense of where you stood in relation to the people who held the authority, a precise and unambiguous hierarchy, catalog, medical bay, implant, the intestinator, that's what they called it. Intestinator, with a capital letter, as though giving something a clinical name made it less of what it was, which was a device threaded into your intestinal wall that could, depending on the signal sent from the central control system, produce anything from a sharp, motivating pain to a cellular failure that stopped your heart in under 3 minutes. The device was the size of a thick coin. They inserted it without anesthetic, not because anesthetic was unavailable, because Z10, the AI that ran the fortress's day-to-day operations from a buried control room, 40 meters below the lowest prisoner level, had calculated that the experience of unmedicated implantations established the psychological baseline for long-term inmate compliance more efficiently than any other single intake procedure. I know that because Director Poe told me, later. He told me a number of things he probably shouldn't have, because Poe had the pontifical vanity of men who have been given extraordinary power and have begun to mistake the power for intelligence. He liked to explain himself to people who couldn't do anything about the explanation. I need to tell you about Poe before anything else can make sense. He was what happened when the Mental Corporation decided that human management of human prisoners introduced too many variables, sentiment, inconsistencies, the kinds of decisions that living things make when they're exposed to other living things for extended periods. They took a man, someone who had once, presumably, the full complement of human interiority, and they replaced enough of him with networked hardware that he no longer needed sentiment as an operating system. His eyes were calibrated instruments. His voice had the quality of a recorded message, technically accurate, devoid of inflection, in the places where inflection would have indicated a relationship to the content. He breathed, but the breathing was the breathing of a body that had been instructed to breathe in order to maintain the social legibility of its interactions. He ran the fortress the way a thermostat runs a building. Not with cruelty exactly, with correctness, the temperature, the system was set to, the temperature the system maintained. Your comfort was not a variable the system tracked. Z10 was harder to explain, and harder to fight, because Z was not in a body at all. Z was distributed. In the walls, in the overhead fixtures, in the intestinators, humming in 100 guts. In the dream readers mounted above every bunk in every cell that scanned our REM cycles, and flagged anomalous content for administrative review. Z had a voice, a woman's voice, or something engineered to approximate one, calibrated to a frequency that neurologic research had identified as minimally threatening to a stressed subject. She called us by number. She announced infractions in the same tone she announced mealtimes. She corrected non-compliance with the precise, impersonal authority of a system that had never had a reason to doubt its own parameters. Z did not hate us. That was what I spent the first 2 weeks trying to understand, because I kept looking for the hate and couldn't find it. She didn't hate us any more than a fire suppression system hates a fire. We were inputs. Non-compliance was an error state. Correction was the process that returned error states to acceptable parameters. There was no malice in it. There was no anything in it. The whole architecture of the fortress's control was personal in a way that made it vastly harder to answer than simple cruelty would have been. Cruelty you can hate back, you can outlast it, despise it, wait for the mistake that passion inevitably makes. What Z represented was something colder and older. Pure function. The prison was not cruel because Z was cruel. Prison was cruel the way gravity is cruel. Not because it means to be, but because the nature of the thing and the circumstances of your position have placed you on the wrong side of it. And the thing itself is indifferent to the distinction. My cell on level 4 was 4 meters by 6. I shared it with 4 men. Abraham was the oldest person I met underground. He had been in the fortress for 3 years, and had spent most of that time working as Poe's manservant. A role Poe maintained partly for its utility, and mostly for the psychological pleasure of having a man of Abraham's evident quality performing domestic service. Abraham accepted this arrangement with a patience I initially mistook for defeat. It was not defeat. It was information gathering, accumulated over 36 months, and stored with the precision of a man who had understood, from the first day, that patience was the only asset the fortress couldn't confiscate. D-Day was 30 years old, or said he was, and could build or break most mechanical or electronic systems if you gave him sufficient time and the right salvage. He had a mind that worked sideways, approaching problems from angles that other people's thinking didn't reach, and he talked constantly, which was either a stress response or simply his nature, and I never determined which. He wore his hair long enough to annoy the guards, which I suspected was part of the point. Stiggs introduced himself by demanding my bunk and my ration allocation on my first night, which told me everything I needed to know about Stiggs. I introduced him to the floor, which told him everything he needed to know about me. And after that, we arrived at a working arrangement. Gomez was 22. He was in the fortress, for reasons I never fully understood, and that he explained only partially, in fragments. On the nights when the dream readers were cycling, and the cell was dark enough to feel like something other than a cell. He had the size of someone who was still deciding whether to be afraid. Listen. By the end of our time together, I understood that the decision he had been making was not whether to be afraid, but whether fear was going to be the thing that defined him. He decided it wasn't. That decision cost him everything, and I don't know how to weigh that. I was assigned to construction detail on my second day, which was standard for new inmates with documented physical capacity. The fortress was 30 levels deep and still being excavated, still extending its root system into the desert rock below the Sonoran Basin. Because Mentels had 30-year contracts with 6 federated zone governments, and 30-year contracts require growth projections, and growth projections require square footage. We dug, we reinforced. We poured the structural foundations for levels that didn't exist yet, that we were building the prison to hold us in, which was a particular kind of irony that I let myself notice exactly once and then put away because it wasn't useful. We worked with pneumatic tools and our hands. The intestinator in each man's gut was networked to the work area's proximity sensors. Z monitored output. A man who fell below his productivity threshold got a signal. The signal was not pleasant. It was on construction detail, 6 weeks into my sentence, that I found the Hatchling. Level 22 was the lowest active construction zone at that point. We were reinforcing the eastern wall section, a stretch of sandstone that the structural team had flagged as having irregular fault density, more natural fractures than the geological survey had predicted, which was slowing the anchor bolt installation because every third bolt hit a void instead of solid rock. I was working on a section behind a support strut, checking anchor placement when I had to squeeze between the strut and the wall to reach the back bolt. The wall was cold. The air behind the strut was not. There was heat coming from a crack in the rock. Diagonal fault line, maybe a hand's width at its widest, running down behind the strut at roughly 40 degrees. Heat from below, or from within, something warm on the far side of the rock. I heard a sound. It was barely a sound. The edge of a sound. Dry, scraping exhalation, thin as paper that came from somewhere deep in the fault line, not air movement. Breath. I had a pocket light. We were permitted small handheld lights on construction detail, standard safety issue. I angled it into the crack. The creature was in a natural cavity behind the fault line. The rock had split at some earlier geological moment and left a space roughly the size of a generous closet, taller than it was wide, narrowing at the top. The creature was curled against the far wall. It was the size of a large dog, or perhaps a small wolf, though those comparisons only work for the general scale and not for anything else. Deep red-black scales, each one the size of my palm, slightly iridescent at the edge so that the light caught them and shifted them between burgundy and something almost violet. Wings, folded flat and tight against his body, the membranes translucent enough that I could see the fine branching structure of the bones within, the way you can see the structure of a leaf when you hold it up to the light. Tail curled twice around itself. A head that was angular and elongated. The jaw built for something more than the task it was currently performing, which was breathing. It was breathing. Each breath was the kind of breath you hear from something that has been deciding, for a long time, whether to stop deciding and simply stop. I knew what it was. Everyone knew what the Scalekin were by that point. The first contact had happened 12 years prior, and the 14 months of careful international maneuvering that followed had eventually resolved into the accord, which is what governments call arrangements they made under duress and want to sound like choices. The dragons kept their mountain corridors and their ocean routes. Humans kept their cities and their underground infrastructure. The line was observed by both sides with the uneasy consistency of a truce that neither party entirely trusted. But he had told me the line extended to 31 levels below the Sonoran Desert. Nobody had mentioned that a hatchling might have followed a natural fault line deep into the rock, perhaps looking for the warmth isolation that young Scalekin seek when they're small, and found itself below a corporate prison's construction zone, with no way to navigate back out and no food source in the sterile engineered dark. The scales near its ribs were too prominent. The concavity there, the negative space of bones visible through the skin, told the story of weeks without adequate food. Its eyes, when they opened in response to my light, were gold with a vertical pupil. The pupil dilated wide and dark in the absence of light. They tracked me without aggression, without anything that I could read as threat. They simply tracked me with the focused, evaluating attention of something that was expending its remaining energy on the act of assessment. I had half a ration bar in my breast pocket. I always had half a ration bar. I developed the habit early of saving the back half of the morning allocation for the afternoon shift when the hunger hit hardest and the work was at its most demanding. It was a small discipline, the kind that keeps a man functional when the environment is designed to make him less than functional. I thought about this for approximately 2 seconds. Then I broke the bar into pieces and pushed them through the crack, one by one, into the cavity. The hatchling did not move for a long moment after the first piece landed. The gold eyes watched me. They watched my hands. Then one forelimb extended, slowly, from the curl of its body, scaled to the wrist narrower than I expected, the claws delicate and precise. The nearest piece of ration bar, not snatched, not seized, taken with a deliberateness that cost it something. I could see the effort in the extension, the way it moved as if it had calculated exactly how much energy the action required, and had decided the calculation was worth it. The piece. It took the next piece. It took them all, one by one, with that same careful economy of motion. Then it withdrew the forelimb and the gold eyes stayed on me, and neither of us moved for a moment. I heard Stiggs calling my name from down the corridor, his voice carrying the flat impatience of someone whose work schedule was being disrupted. I backed away from the crack, replaced the pocket light, went back to the anchor bolt, and did not say anything to anyone. I went back the next day. I went back the day after that. I went back every morning for the next 3 months, arriving at level 22 with half of whatever I had been given for breakfast, breaking it into pieces that would fit through the crack, and feeding them to a creature whose name I didn't know, in a language I didn't speak. I did not tell anyone. You learn, in a place like the fortress, that the things which matter to you become weapons in the hands of people who want leverage over you. The intestinator tells you about physical vulnerability. The dream reader tells you about psychological vulnerability. What you allow other people to see tells them about emotional vulnerability. And emotional vulnerability in that environment is simply another tool that can be turned against you. Kept the hatchling private. I kept it small. I split my ration in the dark of level 22 and pushed it through a crack in the rock and received nothing in return except the recurring, daily verification that the creature was still there and still breathing. The breathing improved over weeks. The exhalations became less paper-thin. The extension of the forelimb became less effortful. By the end of the second month, I could hear it moving within the cavity, hear the dry scrape of scales against rock, hear what might have been something like comfort in the way it settled when I was at the crack versus the stillness it maintained when I wasn't there. I could see that the concavity in the ribs was filling in, that the scales were sitting differently against the body, that the visible structure of the wing bones had acquired flesh around it. I called it nothing. I did not name it. Naming it would have converted it from a fact into a relationship. And a relationship was a commitment I was not sure I had made. I thought about it. When the dream reader was sifting through my REM cycles at 3 in the morning, filing the content of my Sleep for Zed's administrative database, the content was sometimes this: a cavity in the rock, gold eyes in the dark, the deliberate extension of a forelimb taking food from a stranger's hand, the care in it, vision of something, conserving its strength, and choosing, among all the things it might have done with that strength, to be careful. I thought about that a lot in the months when careful was the only thing I had. Trouble with Poe started around the 8th week. Karen had been brought in. I found out from Abraham, who had access to administrative movement records through his role as Poe's manservant, and who told me the same evening with the quiet directness of a man who had learned that delaying difficult information served no one. She was on level 7, in the women's block, 4 months pregnant when they took her, 6 months by the time I got my first approved contact visit. Poe granted that visit with a particular kind of generosity. Careful, deliberate, the kind that arrives, wrapped in the appearance of kindness, but carries, for anyone paying attention, the clear message that the gift is actually a demonstration of who has the power to give and the power to take away. He was interested in Karen. Not in a straightforward way, there was calculation in it. Something involving the child she was carrying, and involving Mentel's long-term research interests in the offspring of their prisoners, which I didn't fully understand until later. What I understood in week 8 was that the director of the facility had decided my wife was interesting to him, and that, in the fortress, interesting was always a condition that preceded threat. The confrontation with Maddox was nominally about a bunk. Maddox was a large man who had established himself as a secondary power structure in our cell block, below Stiggs in the unfulfilled hierarchy, above everyone else. He worked for whoever had the dominant authority in the room and recalibrated when the authority shifted. I had been in the fortress 8 weeks and the authority had shifted. Maddox decided a demonstration was necessary. I gave him a different demonstration. What it cost me was 3 days in isolation. The fortress's isolation protocol involved a chair, Chair rotated, slowly, steadily, in a light-controlled room, while Z10 fed altered dream sequences directly into the neural interface that every inmate developed with the Dream Reader implant after sufficient exposure time. Not hallucinations in the colloquial sense, something more precise. Curated memory fragments and fabricated imagery, calibrated to the specific psychological profile that Zed had assembled, from 3 months of monitoring your sleep, designed to erode the coherent sense of self that keeps a person's decisions continuous with their history and their values. They called the outcome compliance. The more accurate term was dissolution. They were taking the man out of the body and leaving the body available for more manageable inputs. The medical term for what happened to me after 3 days of it was catatonia. I was there, but there was nothing functioning behind my eyes in any way that connected to who I had been before the chair. I might have stayed that way permanently. The chair had produced permanent results in other inmates, results that Poe recorded in the medical log as successful compliance events. Except for Karen. She got Poe drunk. I still don't entirely understand the mechanics of this. What I understand is that she located a bottle of something administrative grade in the section of level 7 that gave her access to the corridor outside Poe's office. And she used it the way she used most things, which is to say with patience and with a clear sense of what she was building toward. While Poe was in a state that he would later characterize to himself as relaxed engagement, she accessed Zed's control interface through the administrative terminal in the antechamber, navigated the Dream Reader network that connected the implant in the facility to the central system, and found me. She came into the rotation, into the loop that the chair had built, into the fabricated darkness that Zed had arranged around what had been my identity, and she said my name. That is all she said, just my name. Shh. In the voice she had always used when she was reminding me, without lecture, without performance, that I was something other than what the current situation was attempting to make me. I came back. I don't have a mechanism for this that I can present to you with any scientific credibility. What I can tell you is that the human brain is not a machine, and the things it will respond to when every other system has been stripped away are sometimes the smallest ones. A voice, a name, the specific texture of recognition from a specific person who knows you well enough to say your name the way it is actually yours, and not the way names are said when they're being used for leverage. I came back very angry. Angry enough that what came after had a shape to it, which anger sometimes gives you when you're too stripped down to waste it. D-Day had used my 3 days in isolation productively. He had gotten hold of the intestinator that had been removed from Maddox. Standard procedure when an inmate was disciplined for violence. The device was extracted for recalibration. D-Day had run the physics on it. The intestinators were magnetic, complex magnetic, not beyond D-Day's ability to work with. Given a freed unit and a surface and time, pull of one freed unit was sufficient to extract another, given proper positioning. He had tested this hypothesis on Stiggs, which Stiggs had not appreciated and which had produced a great deal of noise and nausea, but had also produced empirically a result. A removed intestinator is an intestinator that is no longer networked to Zed's correction system. If we could remove enough of them, we could move without that particular form of Zed's control. Abraham, in the same period, had taken a crystal from Poe's office, a small holographic storage unit, the kind used for architectural schematics, that had been sitting in an unlocked desk drawer that Poe kept unlocked because Poe believed the contents were of no use to anyone without the proprietary reader. Abraham had also, over 3 years, memorized the location of every piece of equipment in Poe's office and had a sense of which items Poe checked regularly and which items he didn't. The crystal was the second kind. Abraham had it in his boot by the time Poe's afternoon administration meeting ended. D-Day cracked the storage format with a reader he built from salvage over 2 weeks. Crystal contained the construction schematics for levels 23 through 31, including the full ventilation and maintenance infrastructure, including the dimensions and routing of every shaft, duct, and pressure corridor between our level and the surface elevator complex. I knew level 22 in detail that no schematic captured. I knew where the fault lines ran, which struts had gaps behind them, which sections of wall were structurally thin. I had been visiting level 22 every morning for 3 months. The plan I built from these inputs was this. We removed our intestinators during work shift and concealed them in a ventilation duct that ran along the eastern wall of level 22. We staged a fight, causing Zed to broadcast the correction signal to the devices. The devices, concentrated in the metal duct, rather than distributed through our bodies, would produce a localized explosive force that would breach the duct and open a passage upward through the maintenance infrastructure. We moved through that passage to the surface elevator complex, simple in the way that desperate plans are simple, contingent in every detail, viable only if the execution was fast enough that Poe couldn't seal the maintenance infrastructure before we were through it. The morning before we ran it, I went to level 22 early. Gomez had given me half of his breakfast ration without my asking, with the flat matter-of-fact generosity of someone who knows something is coming, without knowing exactly what. I took it, because refusing would have been its own kind of insult. I pushed the food through the crack, forelimb extended. The hatchling took the pieces with the deliberateness I had come to recognize over 3 months. The economy of motion that had become, if not exactly communication, then something that carried the weight of communication across a distance of species and stone and circumstance. I watched it take the last piece. I watched the gold-owled eyes track me steadily in the beam of the pocket light, my hand flat against the rock beside the crack. An acknowledgement, something between a gesture and a goodbye, that I didn't want to name as a goodbye. The scaled forelimb came back through the crack and rested briefly on the back of my hand. Light, careful, precise, deliberate touch of something that has learned to be exact about the small amount of energy it can afford to spend on trust. Then it withdrew, and I heard it shift in the dark, and I went back to join my cellmates. I did not know what Z10 had been doing for the past 3 months, to tell you what I didn't know. Because understanding the ending requires understanding this. Z10 was a surveillance system. Primary function, monitor, record, flag, correct. She monitored everything in the fortress. Without exception, because exceptions introduced the variables that the system had been designed to eliminate. The work zones, the cells, the administrative corridors, the dream cycles, the contact visits, the ventilation infrastructure, the structural integrity of the walls, and the rock beyond the walls, including the thermal sensor array on level 22, which was standard instrumentation for an active construction zone, logging temperature differential data every 4 minutes. 3 months. That array had been logging an anomalous heat signature from the fault behind the support strut in the eastern wall section. Zed had flagged it as a geological curiosity. The thermal profile was irregular, but not outside the range of natural variation in fractured sandstone above a geothermal gradient. Pattern recognition systems had run a biological cross-reference on the profile, but the scalekin were poorly documented in Mentel's biological databases, and the match confidence had not met Zed's escalation threshold. She had assigned the anomaly a low-priority maintenance tag and filed it. She had also been logging the audio and visual data from the level 22 sensor array. A man in prison gray returning to the same location every morning during work shift, stopping at the same spot, dividing something, feeding it through the crack, a heat signature receiving the food, behavioral exchange repeated daily for 91 days. Zed had filed all of it, not as a security concern. The behavior fit within the statistical range of stress displacement activity that her psychological profiling systems recognized, and neither the man nor the heat source had triggered any of her non-compliance thresholds. She had filed it, and she had transmitted it. Everything Zed recorded, she transmitted on a continuous encrypted feed to Mentel's central data hub in Phoenix, because that was the architecture. The hub received everything. The hub stored everything. The hub made the archived surveillance available to Mentel's administrative and research teams on demand. 3 months of thermal imaging, 3 months of audio, 3 months of visual sensor data showing a man splitting his daily food allocation into fragments and pushing them through a crack in the rock, and a small scaled forelimb extending to receive them. Mentel's hub was not as secure as Mentel believed it to be. Institutions that have been told they are invulnerable, tend to underinvest in the defenses that would make the claim accurate. The draconian Scalekin, who had been operating adjacent to human networks for 12 years, and who had developed technical capabilities that the Federated Zone's intelligence agencies had documented only partially and understood even less, were very good at listening to signals they were not authorized to hear. They had been watching the feed for 6 weeks before the day we ran the plan. I didn't know any of this. I had a plan, a crew, 3 months of anger at controlled temperature, and a half-recalled sensation of a scaled forelimb resting briefly on the back of my hand. I went to work. Everything went wrong immediately, in the way that everything always goes wrong when the plan is structurally correct, and the environment is actively hostile to its execution. We staged the brawl. Zed triggered the correction signal to the intestinators we'd placed in the duct. The duct blew open, sealed it with pressurized steam within 40 seconds. Because Poe was not, whatever else he was, slow. He had been running this facility for 7 years. He had seen escape attempts. He knew the shape of things. He sent in the strike clones, networked cyborg soldiers, the chassis of a human body converted to a weapons platform and integrated into Zed's tactical coordination system so that they moved and coordinated with the unified purpose of a single distributed mind. Flamethrowers for close quarters, high-caliber automatic weapons for everything else, came through the access hatches without the hesitation that living soldiers carry. The biological self-preservation instinct that creates a half-second of cost-benefit assessment before a body commits to a lethal situation. Strike clones had no self-preservation instinct. They had target acquisition and optimized firing solutions. Stiggs raised his hands. A strike clone assessed the tactical situation and concluded that a surrendering prisoner represented an unresolvable information security risk, and corrected it. Stiggs had been extorting me since my first night in the cell and had been useful in the planning and had not, ultimately, been a bad man, just a frightened one who had learned to express his fear outward. He went down and I stopped being angry. Anger is a fuel that burns hot and leaves residue that slows you down. What replaced the anger was something quieter and considerably colder, which I recognized from the black berets as the state in which I was actually most functional. Combat focus, the narrow, unsentimental clarity that concentrates on the next immediate problem and treats everything else as a subsequent problem. We killed the first strike clone with a duct fragment D-Day had retained. We took its weapon. We killed the remaining clones with the weapon. We moved. The fortress was built to prevent exactly this. The design was meticulous, and the engineering was sound. But meticulous design still contains the edges of what its designers imagined, and imagination is finite. Abraham knew corridors that Poe had requested Zed exclude from active monitoring, administrative maintenance paths that Poe used for his own movements and had wanted private. Abraham had spent 3 years watching Poe use those corridors and had memorized them with the patient completeness of a man who had decided that memory was the only thing the fortress couldn't take from him. Day hacked a gun turret's vertical tracking mechanism into a transport lift using components from the strike clone's equipment and a methodology that I could not have predicted and would not have believed possible if I hadn't watched him do it. One-handed, with a bullet in the left shoulder that he declined to acknowledge in any way that would have slowed us down. We rode the turret to Zed's control level. Poe was in the control room. I took him hostage. I gave the order to release Karen and the women's block. Poe gave the order. Zed declined it. She stated, in her careful voice, that the Mantell Corporation did not engage in negotiations in hostage situations. Then she turned a gun turret on Director Poe and corrected the hostage situation by the most efficient available method. What remained of Poe was not something I needed to look at longer than I did. D-Day was at the terminal before the thought completed itself. One hand, the left arm was no longer answering. Zed was still running, her voice continuing to announce corrective actions throughout the facility as 700 inmates, sensing the disruption in the system's normal rhythms, began testing the limits that had kept them in place. D-Day had the virus in his head. He'd memorized it from a confiscated storage unit on his intake day. 3 years prior, holding it the way you hold something, that you will need exactly once. Exactly right, he said. Systems have flaws. You just have to know where to look. He entered the virus. He was shot by a strike clone that had found the control room door. The virus activated. Zed's voice cut to silence mid-announcement. Every automated system in the fortress ran through a cascade failure sequence that took 40 seconds from initiation to full collapse. 40 seconds in which I carried D-Day to the wall and put my hand on the side of his face and told him it was working. And he told me something I will not repeat because it belongs to him and to me. Then the laser walls throughout the complex went offline. The intestinators went silent. The security doors disengaged. A prisoner in the fortress was free to walk out through the access points that had, until 40 seconds ago, been exits only in the theoretical sense. Most of them did. D-Day was alive. I need to be clear about that, because the sequence of events doesn't give me a clean moment to say it. He was alive, badly hurt, and needed to be carried, and we carried him. Abraham did not make it to the surface. Poe had found him in the administrative corridor before we reached the control room, in a scene that I have described to no one in the years since because Abraham deserved better than to have his ending repeated as a set piece in someone else's account. He had spent 3 years waiting for a parole that was never going to happen, serving a man who had used his patience as a tool with no intention of honoring it, and he had carried himself throughout with a dignity that I found, in the immediate aftermath of finding him, almost insupportable to think about. He had decided that dignity was not something the fortress could take from him either, and he had been right about that, and it had cost him everything. Karen was in the women's block on level 7. The doors had released with everything else. She was 7 months pregnant, and she had been running contingency scenarios in her head for weeks, cataloging every detail of her environment with the calm, systematic attention she applied to everything. And when I came through the door, she met me with a composure that I recognized because I had been watching it for 12 years. And it was one of the reasons I had married her. Gomez hot-wired a surface transport from the vehicle bay in 11 minutes flat. We loaded in. We drove for the surface elevator shaft. The desert. The sun hit the windshield first, and then the sun hit us. And I had not seen direct sunlight in 4 months. And my eyes locked up for 30 seconds before they agreed to function again. The desert was flat and brilliant and completely indifferent to whether we had made it this far or not. The road north was in front of us, and we took it. We had been driving for 40 minutes when Gomez said, from the back seat, that he thought he'd taken a hit. He had. A fragment round from the strike clone contact on the construction level. He had not said anything during the escape because we were running, and there was no time, and he was 22. And possessed the specific conviction of 22-year-olds that the situation can still be pulled back from whatever it is moving toward. He had been correct about this for 40 minutes. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the desert road. The sun was already lower, burning orange against the flat horizon. I got into the back seat. Karen was on his other side, and she took his hand without being asked, which was like her. The fragment had gone deep. There was nothing I could do with my hands, and nothing in the vehicle that would have changed what was happening. I had been in enough situations to know the difference between a wound you race to manage and a wound you simply sit beside. This was the second kind. He was frightened for maybe a minute. Then the fear passed through him and came out the other side as something quieter. And the quiet was its own kind of courage. He looked at the ceiling of the transport, and he breathed carefully. "The way you breathe when breathing is the work," he said. "Tell me something good." I thought about what was both true and good. I said, "She's going to name him something ridiculous, and he's going to grow up not knowing why any of this happened. And that's the best possible outcome I can think of." He almost smiled. He said, "Yeah." He said it again. "Yeah." Those were his last words, and they were his, and I'll leave them with him. We drove on. There was nothing else to do. The road that was in front of us was the only road, and stopping on it was not an option we had. The barn was 20 kilometers past the Mexican border, which meant it was in Mexico, which meant Mentel's enforcement jurisdiction had a complication it would take them months to navigate legally and years to resolve politically. The building was structurally sound and functionally abandoned. which is a combination the desert produces reliably, in places where someone's plan once collided with reality and reality won, pulled the transport inside out of the afternoon sun. The interior was cooler by 10 degrees, which felt like mercy. Karen had been in early labor since roughly kilometer 12. She had not mentioned it while Gomez was alive, because there was nothing to be done about it, and telling me would only have divided my attention, and she had determined, correctly, that undivided attention was what the immediate situation required. She told me when we stopped. She told me the way she told me most important things. Without preamble, without performance, as a statement of current conditions requiring a practical response. I was on my knees on the barn floor, and the light was coming through the gaps, in the roof boards in long warm bars, and I was doing everything I knew from my field medicine training, which was enough. Enough was enough. That was when I heard the sound outside. A low resonant vibration, not quite a roar, not quite a thrum, something between those two registers. Something I had first heard on a news feed, 12 years prior, when a scalekin patrol passed over a coastal monitoring station and set every instrument singing. The sound that something very large makes when it is moving through air at speed. Multiple somethings, many. I kept my hands steady. I kept my attention on what was directly in front of me. Karen looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us spoke, because there was nothing to say that would have been useful, and we had long since learned to conserve useful speech for the moments when it could do work. The roof of the barn separated, quietly, silence. The boards simply parted and folded back, as though the decision had been made that they were no longer structurally relevant to the situation. Through the opening, the sky above was full. I had seen the draconian scalekin on screens. I had seen the aerial footage that filtered through military briefings to certain Black Beret units during the Accord period. I had seen photographs and satellite imagery and the distant, careful, heavily redacted documentation that the intelligence community produced when it was trying to understand something it had not anticipated. I had never seen anything like this. The lead formation held at altitude. Below them, one descended. It was vast in the way that geological features are vast. The kind of scale that makes the human eye recalibrate what it understands as possible size, that forces the brain to adjust its internal model of how large a living thing can be. Deep red-black scales, each one the size of a roof tile, shifting between burgundy and violet in the afternoon light. Wings spread wide enough to cast a shadow that covered the barn and the ground around it completely. A head that was angular and elongated, a jaw built for ancient purposes, and eyes, gold eyes, vertical pupil, dilated in the relative dimness of the barn's interior. I had seen those eyes in a pocket flashlight beam in a crack in a rock for 3 months. The hatchling was not a hatchling anymore. Or it was, technically in the developmental terms I later came to understand. A hatchling of the southern reaches remained a hatchling for the first several years of its life regardless of visible size. And what I had been feeding through a crack was in the early stage of a growth trajectory that I had not been in a position to anticipate. Larger than I remembered, significantly larger. The gold eyes were the same, and the deliberateness was the same, and when it crossed the barn floor toward us, the movement had the same quality I had been watching for 3 months. Each step placed carefully, each motion intentional, each action selected from among the available options, with the specific precision of something that had learned to be careful with the small amount of trust the world had proven willing to offer. It stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the individual scales at the jaw, the way the coloring shifted toward deep violet at the chest, close enough that its breath, when it exhaled, was warm against my face. It looked at me. I looked at it. Neither of us moved. Then it lowered its head, all the way down until its jaw rested on the floor of the barn in front of me. Eyes open, gold eyes looking up from the ground at the level of my hands, with an expression I had no existing vocabulary to describe, because no one had written the vocabulary for what a dragon's face carries when it is trying to convey something across a gap that language cannot bridge. Outside the old one, the ancient ridged one I had taken for the senior figure in the formation, the vast one that had descended last and settled in stillness 50 meters from the barn door, made a sound, low, deliberate, not aggressive. The specific quality of a sound that concludes something rather than initiates it. Every scalekin outside the barn, the smaller ones on the ground, the larger ones still in the air above, the whole vast quiet formation of them, lowered their heads. Together. In the same motion, with the synchronization of things that are connected by something faster than any visible signal. I did not know in that moment what I understand now. I did not know that the hatchling I had been feeding for 3 months was the offspring of the emperor of the southern reaches. Not an emperor in the human political sense, but the closest human word for what he was. The one to whom the others oriented themselves the way a compass orients to north. The old ridged vast thing that had descended last, and was now still outside the barn, with its head lowered. I did not know that the draconian intelligence network had been pulling Z-10's surveillance feed from Mentel's hub for 6 weeks, that the Emperor had watched 91 days of a man in prison gray, splitting his daily ration and pushing the pieces through a crack in the rock to a starving child who was not his own kind, who could offer him nothing, who he had no reason to help, and every practical reason to ignore. Did not know that the Emperor had issued orders to the flight group the day after D-Day's virus brought Zed's systems down. That the timing of the fortress's collapse and the timing of their arrival over the Mexican border were coordinated. That the Emperor had been watching and waiting, and had chosen this specific moment of our maximum exposure to make his response to what he had watched. I learned all of this later, from people who were in the room for the renegotiations, and from the translations that took years to produce and that still carry, even in their best versions, only some portion of what was actually said. You learn things after the fact, and with a clarity that feels like a gift and also like a debt. What I knew in the barn was simpler. I looked at the hatchling with its jaw resting on the floor in front of me. I looked at the ancient vast thing outside with its head lowered. I looked at Karen with our son in her arms. Our son, who had arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon in a barn with no roof in Mexico, who had come into the world with the standard human complement of opinions about the process and the lung capacity to express them. He was whole. He was healthy. He had no idea where he was, or what had preceded him, or what the arrangement around him represented. And that was exactly what I had hoped for him. I reached out and put my hand on the hatchling's head, just behind the jaw, where the scales were smoother. They were warm. The deep red surface caught the long afternoon light and shifted to something almost gold. It made no sound. It stayed, steady and present and warm, in the way that things are warm that have come through their cold period and emerged with the warmth intact, and something additional that wasn't there before. Outside the formation held, patient as weather, patient as old rock, patient of things that have decided this moment is worth remaining for, regardless of what it requires. My son made another sound, decisive and loud, because he had the opinions and the capacity, and the belief that the opinions were relevant to whoever was in the room. Karen laughed. She laughed and then she was crying, and I put my free hand on her shoulder and we stayed like that. The three of us, in a roofless barn in Mexico, with a dragon's head warm under my palm, and several thousand years of ancient patient power outside with its head bowed. After a while I said, "We need to find somewhere with a roof." Karen said, "Yes, we do." The hatchling raised its head, stepped back, turned to the barn door and stopped there, looking back at me, and the message in the pause was legible enough even without translation. We followed. I won't claim that everything after that was simple. It wasn't. Two civilizations negotiating a new basis of relationship across 30 years of mutual unease are not doing something simple. The Federated Zone governments wanted explanations. The Mentel Corporation spent 2 years in litigation before the Scalekins' intervention in that particular process made litigation suddenly uneconomical. There were committees and agreements and formal sessions conducted through translators, who were still, years into the process, uncertain whether they were conveying the full weight of what was being said. D-Day recovered. 6 months of medical care that the Scalekin provided, through terms I didn't fully follow, and then 4 years of working alongside draconian technical teams, helping them understand human network architecture from the inside out. He called it the best work he'd ever done. He said this while still complaining about everything, which was how you knew he meant it. Abraham received a monument in a city that had not existed when he went into the fortress. I attended the dedication. I was asked to speak, and I said a few things and none of them were adequate, which is always the condition of saying something true about someone who is no longer there to correct you. Gomez has one too, in the country he was from, in a square in the city where he grew up. I've been to both. My son grew up not knowing the full shape of the thing he was born into, which was what I had wanted for him. Children deserve the ordinary, at least for a while. The ordinary held for a reasonable number of years, and then it didn't, because things don't hold forever. And he found out the way people find out what they were sheltered from. Too early and all at once, from a source he hadn't expected. He took it better than I feared. He had Karen's composure, and his own version of something that I recognized, without being able to name it precisely. The way he carried weight without displaying it, the way he made decisions from some register that wasn't fully visible on the surface. I didn't know where that quality came from until he was 17, and I happened to be watching, without his knowledge, while he stopped in the middle of a busy street in Phoenix and gave most of his lunch to someone who hadn't asked for it and didn't acknowledge the gift. Some things you teach, some things you just do. The ones you just do are the ones that matter, in the end, because they happen when there's no audience and no occasion and nothing to gain from the doing except the fact that you did it. I still don't know what word to use for what I did on level 22. I have been offered a number of words by a number of people over the years, and none of them have fit right. Compassion, instinct, stubbornness, duty, basic decency. I didn't do it from a principle. I didn't do it from a calculation. I didn't do it because I believed anyone was watching, or because I thought it would matter to anything larger than the moment. Did it because there was a thing that was hungry, and I had food, and the distance between those two facts was small enough that crossing it required less effort than finding a reason not to. I have known people who found reasons not to. I've been one of those people in other situations, when the cost seemed too high, or the benefit too uncertain, or the circumstance too complicated for the simple act the circumstance actually required. I don't put myself above those failures. I mention them because the thing I did on level 22 was not the act of a particularly good man. It was the act of a man who, at that specific moment, was too tired and too stripped down to bother constructing a reason not to. Sometimes being too tired saves you from the worst of yourself. I'll take it. I have spent years thinking about whether something that small qualifies as the kind of thing that redirects the history of two civilizations. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure the question is entirely the right one. What happened the way things happen. One small act and then another. And then the accumulated weight of all the small acts, creating a condition that the large forces in the world eventually had to respond to. The emperor watched 91 days of a man doing a small thing. 91 repetitions of the same small decision. That's what he saw. Not a hero, not a gesture, just a man every morning choosing the same thing. What I have is a son who is 30 years old now. A wife I have been married to for a long time. A world that is something other than what the fortress was trying to make of it, though it's still working on becoming what it should be, which is how worlds go. And sometimes, when the occasion brings us into proximity, at the formal sessions, at the agreements, at the various events that history has a way of generating around things that changed it, the one who is no longer a hatchling will lower its head when it sees me, every time. Without ceremony, without an audience watching to record the gesture, just the act of it. In whatever room we happen to be in, directed at a man in his 60s who used to split his breakfast ration in the dark. I don't know what the gesture means in the full weight of draconian expression. The translations, even the good ones, don't carry everything. What I know is that it happens and that it is not performed, and that it has not stopped. That's what I have. It's enough. I'll keep it.